Hello, KINS 260. I told you I'd make you something to review for your exam 2 in the class, and here you have a YouTube. Don't forget, we do not meet in our traditional classroom on Wednesday at 1 o'clock. This is your review activity so that you can, it's just meant to help you get ready for the exam. So everything else you've already been doing to get ready for the test, this is just one extra thing you can use. And then do not forget that you have your test on Friday at 1 o'clock. It covers chapters 7 through 11. And here's a couple review things. Hopefully these things are very familiar to you at this point. But a couple review comments just to help you get ready. Think about what's happened to childhood mortality in this country. Think about what we've learned about child, maternal, and infant outcomes. So what do we know about teenage mothers? What do we know about half of all pregnancies in this country? And think about the difference between an intended and an unintended pregnancy and which one is more likely to result in that early and consistent prenatal care that we want. We talked a lot about the gag rule. I told you it was like a ping pong ball. It's back and forth, and it depends on who's in the Oval Office. And it doesn't matter who you voted for. I can tell you that the gag rule is going to be enacted or pulled back, right? So the gag order the gag rule basically just says that you cannot even discuss the option of abortion in family planning clinics. That's been going on since '84, and it's a ping pong ball. It keeps going back and forth. We talked about infant outcomes, and babies born before 37 weeks are preterm, premature babies. And the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends babies be breastfed for the first year of life. So don't get confused about that one. I want you to remember that it says exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months, but it continued, so just generally breastfed for the first year of life. And there's something I talked about with sleeping habits with babies. They even put it on the diapers, remember? Back to sleep. Healthy full-term infants should always be back to sleep to reduce their risk of SIDS. And then we talked about risk factors for death in children, and those unintentional injuries being the leading cause of mortality in children. We talked about that a little more specifically, saying that unintentional injuries or accidents is the biggest category, but really within that it's car accidents. And we talked about maternal leave, or the absence really of maternal leave in this country, because we don't actually have a maternity leave policy in the country. We have family medical leave. The Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, provides unpaid time off. FMLA, all it does is hold your job if you've worked a certain number of hours in the last year and your employer has at least 50 employees. All it does is guarantee that you can come back and you have a job. It's not paid leave. It's not maternity leave. We've talked about children, and we broke down those age groups. So an infant is 0 to 12 months or 1 year. Children are 1 to 9, and then we break that down further. But then adults are categorized as those who are 25 to 64. Remember that one? And then we broke down from 65 plus. At 65, you become an older adult in our country. And if you tell an older adult that because they're 65, they're older, they may not love that. But that's how we do it in this country. And then we broke those down into those 3 super creative categories, right? The young old, middle old, and old old. We talked about those things in class. In that adult category, we talked about who has a higher risk of death between the genders, right? So think about whether men or women or males or females have a higher mortality rate when it comes to the adolescent age period and young adults. I'll give you a hint. It's the guys. We talked a lot about the fact that the health behaviors that you are developing right now in your adolescent and young adulthood, you're likely to continue for the rest of your life. We also talked about things like the more education a person has. This is why education really is a public health intervention to some degree. The more education a person has, the less likely they are to use tobacco, the more likely they are to have a higher income. There's a domino effect there. Remember we put on the board all of those horrible things you said about your grandparents, or older adults, could have been your grandparents. They would have been upset with you. I'm being facetious. But despite all those things we said about people who are older adults in this country, the majority of them are active and well today. The population today in the country, the majority of adults are white, not Hispanic, but that is changing. But today, that's the picture. We talked a lot about disparities between populations, really between races, when it came to things like infant mortality, and the really serious divides that we're seeing. And Indiana is, unfortunately, a really strong example of this. And we talked about this, I know, over a couple different days. So the death rate of African American babies in our state is about triple, really triple that of white babies born in Indiana. So there's a really serious, longstanding disparity there. That's true in Indiana. That is true across the country. Indiana just happens to be a microcosm of a larger divide. We talked about mental health, mental institutions, remember? And I pulled up a picture of Indiana Central Hospital, or Central State Hospital, and Eastern State Hospital. And we talked the article about how they pulled up, or they unearthed human remains on the property there, because our history of mental health care in this country is a little seedy. We do not have a fantastic track record. We have made great improvements to today. That's called, we had the period of deinstitutionalization, a lot of syllables, but deinstitutionalization. And there were 4 criteria that really propelled deinstitutionalization. We've talked about this a couple times. I want you to make sure you feel confident about that. And then remember, about 20% of the population really has a diagnosable disorder, but only about a third of those actually receive treatment. So it's a pretty pervasive issue, but really only about 1/3 are receiving treatment. Recall that period of deinstitutionalization. Remember when it happened? It really is in the 50s, because it overlaps with the development of the civil rights movement. So starting in the 50s, we saw that decline of what was about 500,000 people living in these hospitals down to 25,000 now. And we talked about this. We talked about examples of the Las Vegas Music Festival perpetrator, Parkland. Anytime we have a mass an experience of violence, right? People like to talk about what kind of mental health that person was in, but people with mental health present a very small risk of violence, and it's a very, very poor predictor of future violent behavior. Remember, 20% of the population has a diagnosable disorder, and 20% of the population isn't at risk of committing an act of violence. Then we talked about people who were incarcerated and had mental health issues, and we talked about how jails were designed to confine and punish, not help someone with a diagnosable disorder. And those mental disorders that we were talking about are characterized by an alteration in thinking, mood, and behavior that's associated with distress and impaired functioning. I'm scanning. We talked about this back in chapter 7, so we were thinking about infants and children. The primary unit to nurture infants and children is their family. When a person or a couple decides the number of children they want to have, how they're going to achieve that, so the number, timing, and spacing, and how they get that done is called family planning. We've talked about different federal interventions or federal programs to help improve outcomes for children. And remember, the health screenings, treatment for conditions, and education are all a part of prenatal care. So the WIC program provides nutritional assistance. That's a USDA program. It's all about food access, nutrition. And prenatal care is really health screenings, treatment for conditions, and education. We talked a lot about causes of infant mortality, and low birth weight during pregnancy is associated with cigarette smoking, and that's the leading modifiable cause of low birth weight. So if we can stop people from smoking, particularly while they're pregnant, we can eliminate a lot of preterm and low birth weight babies, and that will decrease our infant mortality rate. We talked a lot, and I asked you guys a question in class about how many of you knew someone, or of someone maybe in your high school, who had either attempted or had committed suicide. And every semester actually I ask this question, and every semester it's maybe even a bigger number. I haven't tracked it, but it's a lot of people raise their hand, because suicide rates for adolescents and young adults has increased significantly in the past 50 years. And you guys, if you remember me just taking that straw poll in class, you've seen that. We talked about some demographics, and we had like the age. We should have been a triangle, right? But people are living longer, so it's much more like a rectangle instead of the triangle. The factors that affect a population size, there's 3. It's fertility, or birth rate, how many babies you have, mortality, how many people die, because your population total includes everyone who hasn't died yet. So if nobody dies, it keeps stacking up and you have a higher population. And then migration, so people who move in and out of your country or in and out of your jurisdiction. Those are the three reasons or three causes that affect population size. And then we talked about a couple key terms, and one I want you to think about is the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio. Remember, we wrote this on the screen, and there were two on the same screen, and it said the dependency ratio is a comparison of those whom society considers productive compared to those society considers unproductive. So it has nothing to do with their job status or how much money they make. It's truly those that we would consider, based on age, to be productive or those to be unproductive, and that was the dependency ratio. And we talked about why that was important in class. We talked about where older adults, how they're financing themselves in their later years when they become an older adult, and the largest percentage of older adult income comes from Social Security. We talked about that in class. We talked about whether or not we thought we would have Social Security when we were older adults. And then we talked about some different statuses or how people migrate from one place to another. And remember that we talked about someone, if they are fleeing their homeland, they're fleeing their country to seek shelter or protection from danger. It is not an option. They are unsafe where they are and they have to leave. Those are refugees. They cannot stay safely where they are. They have to flee that danger. Those are refugees. And the people who move from one country to another for the purposes of just permanent relocation are considered immigrants. They may have serious reasons or social reasons to move, but they decided to move from one to the other, and they're an immigrant. And people who were born in and owe allegiance to another country and other than the one in which they live are considered aliens, and not ET aliens, just aliens. They aren't living in their home country. We talked about mental health. We talked about that really, really influential book. Think about that one. We talked about the fact that people with good mental health are able to function under adversity, adapt to the changes in their environment. Remember, we talked about midterms week, and it's a stressful week, but people with good mental health can adapt to that kind of stress. They're able to curb hate and guilt. We talked a lot about our healthcare system, our mental health care system, and the kind of things we used to do excessively, including lobotomies that we no longer do as nearly as often as we used to. And then we talked about how we break down populations so that we can just better understand them. And the largest racial group in the country are white Americans, but the largest minority population are Hispanic, but the largest racial minority are African Americans or Black Americans, right? Because there's a difference between a race and an ethnicity. So just keep those things in mind. We talked a lot about refugees, and we thought about things, and when you guys shouted these out in class, we talked about things that would be challenging if you were a refugee. If you were in that situation, what would be really difficult for you to figure out? What would be really difficult for you to adjust to? We talked about the fact that you're actually running from a violent situation. That's not fantastic. You've left your homeland. You've probably left family. You've left your belongings. We talked about the fact that you actually left some status probably. And then you're the process of adapting to your new home. We talked about those challenges that refugees face. And then we talked, remember, I gave the comparison of my grandparents' house, right? So we talked about older adults' homes, and we compared like my grandparents' home that they built for $5,000 70 years ago or something, and it's worth like $100,000 now, so that's a great asset, but it's smaller, it's worth less money than the homes that we typically buy now. It needs a lot more work, and it needs more work at a time in life when typically older adults are less able to do that themselves, so it becomes a bit of a cost. So as you're getting ready for this test, I want to give you a couple reminders. Answer every question. Every single question. Please answer every question. Even if you don't know, give me something, right? Pick a true or false. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, that multiple choice, because you have a 25% chance of getting it right. And on a short answer question, if you don't know, look for context clues and give me something, right? Or read back through the test. So maybe something will jog your memory, right? And you'll be able to come up with even a part of the answer, right? And you'll get more points that way. The other thing I've talked to a lot of students about when we did the postmortem meetings is if you are going through a multiple choice question and you can knock out one or two of the answers immediately because they're just kind of absurd, do that. And that gets you down to a 50-50 shot. So maybe it increases your chance of getting some points. And then on those true-false questions, we talked a lot about underlining or highlighting or circling something, those key phrase, or even sometimes it's a prefix to a word that makes it true or false. So if you can really focus your attention in on the phrase or the word that's really the crux of the question, that probably will help you come down to the right answer. I hope you guys had a really good fall break. I hope this is somewhat helpful. If you made it to the end, good job. I think it will serve you well. And if you need something, you can just email me. Just let me know if you have a question about something. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing your test, and I will see you soon. Have a good one. Thanks.